So first of all, I just want to thank Peter for inviting me here, and it's really great to be up in at Queen's talking about commemoration, because I'm really conscious that there's some really good scholars associated with the Institute who've done some very important work in commemoration, so Margaret and Fergal and Marie, for example. So it's really nice to be here, and it's really nice to see you here as well, those of you who have done that great work in commemoration, and everybody else as well, of course. So I think we're all very conscious at this stage, and certainly those of us who are living in the Republic of Ireland are very conscious that Ireland is at the moment marking a series of events that commenced with the introduction of the Third Home Rule Bill in the British House of Commons in 1912 and concluded with the establishment of the Irish Free State in 1922. And in advance of this decade of centenaries, the Irish state established an advisory group, and its principal function, as outlined in the Decade of Centenary website, is to ensure authenticity and proportionality. And I'm very conscious that this website is constantly been updated, and it's just gone through a kind of major overhaul in terms of the latter years of the Decade of Centenaries, and we might even come back to that in questions. But initially the concern was about authenticity and proportionality, and this is achieved, we were told, through the provision of advice that directs the general development of the programme towards commemorations relating to events, issues and processes of significance. So as somebody who's interested in historical frameworks and historical structures, what was interesting to me at the time was what this proportionality was going to result in or lead to, and how this proportionality was going to tie in with particular structures, historical structures, in terms of what's included and what's excluded. One result of this proportionality is that land bills, most notably land purchase acts, are referenced on the Decade of Centenaries website, while the 1920 land seizures and experiments in collectivised farming that accompanied or that followed some of these seizures are not. So essentially the official Decade of Centenaries programme marks the strengthening of absolute property rights in Ireland under the guise of commemorating the transfer of land to those who farmed it, and sidelines challenges to agrarian capitalism and the primacy of private property. So in this talk, I'm going to speculate on why these challenges failed the proportionality test. And I'll then consider how these challenges might actually be remembered, outlining a radical form of commemoration that brushes history against the grain and is organised in conjunction with those from Ireland and elsewhere that currently adhere to a relationship to land and property that challenges societal norms. So as we all know, transforming the chaotic multiplicity of the past into history is always a highly selective process. All human experience within written record is potential historical fodder, but some aspects of that experience are deemed important and therefore worth recounting and commenting on, and others insignificant. The criteria employed by individual historians when making this distinction differs depending on such factors as approach, bias, generally unacknowledged, and focus of interest, but there are also structural factors included. Amongst these structural factors is the tendency within mainstream historiography to favour that which is judged to have had an impact on what happened afterwards. So recently there was, the Irish Times produced a supplement on the latter years, in preparation for the latter years of the Decade of Centenaries, and one of the articles was directed towards school children in the Republic of Ireland, telling them how, essentially what historians do, explaining to them the work of historians. So it's explained in this article that historians consider an event to be significant if it had important consequences for the future. Commemorative practices, while often viewed with suspicion by historians, are similarly orientated to read the past backwards. In fact, I would argue more so. Anything could potentially be commemorated, but commemoration, particularly when endorsed by the state, invariably marks occurrences considered foundational to the development of a people, nation or state. The form of commemoration that I'm proposing in this talk, commemoration against the grain, employs a very different temporal lens. It draws attention to that which is not easily subsumed into a progressivist model of history, centred on the aspects of the past that have most obviously resulted in the present. To commemorate against the grain is to remember occurrences viewed as marginal, contingent, or paradoxical in conventional history writing. It is to indicate that while such occurrences appear to have led nowhere, they may have been the foundations for futures that differ substantially from our own present. Garroda Toohey has quite rightly argued that the ultimate outcome of the land agitation, which he describes as the most effective socio-political movement of collective action in modern Irish history, was the entrenchment of a decidedly individualist system of farm ownership of the sort that is the norm in contemporary Ireland. This entrenchment, I would add, was the direct result of various land purchase acts, designed less to bring about an inversion in land ownership in Ireland, though that's the aspect of them that tends to be emphasised, and it's certainly the aspect of them that's emphasised in the Decade of Centenary website. What they were essentially designed to do was to clarify Irish property rights. Some previous land acts, most notably the Land Act of 1870 and 1881, contained measures that monitored the relationship between landlord and tenant and recognised rights of occupancy that the Irish tenant farmer believed he or she had to the land. Under the 1881 Land Act, for example, rent was no longer fixed by the market but by special tribunals. The landlord's right to evict was restricted, and the tenant farmer was allowed to sell his or her interest in the holding. These acts were feared by some conservative policymakers to have fundamentally breached British conceptions of property laws and rights. It was in part a concern that ambiguous property relations in Ireland could create a precedent that would unsettle concepts of property in England, Scotland and Wales that led the Conservative Party to set in motion a series of acts centred on the purchase of land. In the period between the enactment of the initial land purchase acts of the 1880s and the 1885 Ashburn Act is particularly relevant here, and the establishment of the Irish Free State in 1922, an immense transformation in land ownership dramatically transformed rural Ireland. A survey of estates in the 1870s demonstrated that over half the country was owned by less than 1,000 landlords. 500,000 acres changed hands during the Ashburn Act's first 3 years of operation, while 9 million acres was transferred to the occupiers under the Land Acts introduced by the Conservatives in 1903 and 1904. So in summary, the British political party that claimed to represent landlordism was instrumental in ensuring that the ultimate outcome of the Irish land agitation was a country of individual small farms, its loyalty to the landlord class offset by a greater loyalty to absolute property rights. In O'Toohey's case, an awareness of this outcome has led him to dismiss other concepts and practices of land usage in 19th and early 20th century Ireland, such as land nationalisation and collectivised agriculture, as historical curiosities, and he describes them as non-starters. However, these aspects of Irish history, the elements that appear to have led nowhere but could potentially have resulted in a very different Ireland, are the very ones that are of interest when commemorating against the grain. Such non-starters could be commemorated or could be remembered in a commemorative event held in 2020 towards the end of Ireland's Decade of Centenaries. 2020 is the centenary of heightened agrarian agitation in 1920. A claim published in the Connacht Tribune that year, the violence was sweeping through the West like a prairie fire, may have been overly sensational, but the intensity of agitation is demonstrated by the officially returned agrarian outrages, which were higher in 1920 than in any other year since 1882 at the height of the land war, particularly in the first half of 1920. Some of the agitators, particularly in the east of the country, were agricultural labourers seeking better working conditions and wages. In addition to holding strikes, labourers disrupted fairs and attacked farms. And of course, Conor Costick has written about this in terms of labour in his work on labour militancy during the Irish War of Independence. And just very coincidentally, we had staying in our house last night the son of a man called Christy Supple, and Christy Supple was from Athy, and he was organising farm labourers in Athy in a strike that took place in over, I think, 1922 and 1923. And what's interesting to me is actually, I know Conor Costick has looked at this during the War of Independence, but actually those kind of strikes that actually continued on after the establishment of the Free State. And this man, Christy Supple, was actually arrested and imprisoned under the Irish Free State in 1923, which I think is an interesting kind of aspect of that period. And he also never told his children about it afterwards. They only found out years later, so they had no idea that he'd led a strike. They had no idea he'd been imprisoned. Okay, but back to 1920 and the events of 1920. The dominant form that agrarian outrages took, particularly in the West, was the seizure of land, sometimes carried out by large groups that included women and children. Hundreds of estates and grazing farms were forcibly taken in the early 1920s. In most cases, the land was then broken up into tillage holdings for individual small farmers or landless labourers. The Craig's Land Committee in County Galway took a different approach, establishing a collective farm comprised of thousands of acres of seized land, while the tenants of the absentee landlord James Denison Going declared a Soviet when they took over his 300-acre estate in County Limerick. Both of these practices, the redistribution of large pockets of land, particularly of use for grazing, into small subsistence holdings and the establishment of collective farms, pose a challenge to agrarian capitalism. When resisting the impulse to read the past backwards, one could conclude, as Fergus Campbell did when writing the final chapter of his 2005 publication Land and Revolution, that the outcome of the contest between radical and conservative elements was not clear at the high point of revolution in 1920 and 1921. And I think for those of you who are familiar with Campbell's work, he has distanced himself somewhat from that 2005 publication, but I still think it's an important book. Contemporary witnesses to the land seizures included Kevin O'Sheil, a young barrister who was approached by the illegal Irish government established after the 1918 general election and asked to look into this outbreak of agrarian violence. In a series of articles published in the Irish Times in 1966, O'Sheil reflected back on his subsequent investigation. In some of these pieces, he wrote of the particularly aggressive, bolshy spirit of the agitators he encountered in County Roscommon, and I have a particular interest in that because that's my home county. So, and he talks about, essentially, he says that the Roscommon agitators were exceptionally bad. Upon his arrival there in 1920, he found that most of the ranches, he said, had been cleared of their stock, and roads and lanes all over the county were choked with wandering and half-starved beasts. And of course, just to put that in context, the removal of cattle from a farm and either placing them on another farmer's land or leaving them on a road some distance from the farm was a common tactic employed against non-residential graziers or ranchers during the ranch war of 1906 to 1909 and afterwards. Anti-grazier agitation was particularly prevalent in parts of the country such as Connacht, where large grazing farms were established alongside small holdings. Non-residential grazing was the epitome, really, of agrarian capitalism, in that it was most often associated with shopkeepers or publicans with surplus capital hoping to make a quick profit. O'Toohey, in a more recent commentary, has outlined why the seizure of land was particularly prevalent in that part of Connacht. In County Roscommon, small farmers and landless labourers, O'Toohey explains, were less concerned with the long-term issue of land redistribution than with quick access to Conacre land for survival. In other western areas, a number of those involved in land seizures were farmers who had already obtained land under the Land Purchase Acts and wanted to add to their, in some cases, already substantial holdings. However, the Roscommon agitators were typical of those who had not benefited from the Acts at all, in that there were either labourers who owned no land or small farmers whose ownership of unviable holdings had left their circumstances largely unchanged. So as demonstrated by the weapons they carried, their invasion of estates had a very practical and immediate dimension. They arrived likely armed with loys and an occasional pitchfork, a contemporary observer tells us. The police arriving to find that strips had already been or had been divided out and digging was in full swing. For these poor rural dwellers, the Irish land question was far from answered by the Land Purchase Acts included in the Decade of Centenary websites amongst the events that shaped modern Ireland. Neither were they likely to benefit significantly in the long term from the Congested District Board's land redistribution programme. The board, established by Arthur Balfour in 1891, was charged with relieving congestion on land in the west of the country, including County Roscommon, but its impact was somewhat limited in that it could only redistribute land that landlords and farmers were willing to sell to it. And in fact, the conditions of some members of the rural poor had deteriorated over the previous years rather than improving or staying static, and that those who had once enjoyed rights of common grazing in untenanted pastures now found that these lands tended to be in the hands of graziers. The vast majority of the emigrants in the final years of the 19th century and early 20th century were the rural poor who had helped make the Irish land agitation such an effective socio-political movement. And, of course, through emigration, the rural poor of Ireland became the urban proletariat of Britain and elsewhere, contradictorily characterised as both an obstacle to class struggle and key players in the most revolutionary working class movements. Further land reform might have curtailed emigration, but it was not to the advantage of the substantial farmer, and therefore it failed to attain the full endorsement of the nationalist politicians who were keen to gain the support of this important constituency. And essentially the emigration of this these poor rural inhabitants led to a further entrenchment of the individualist system of farm ownership that O'Toole claims is the ultimate outcome of the land movement, allowing those who had gained most from the Land Purchase Acts, the large and medium farmers, to consolidate their economic and political power. And the extent to which the needs of the poor rural dwellers were to diverge from those of the nationalist leadership became apparent in 1920 when an alternative legal system was established under the First Dáil, and established largely to protect farmers from those larger farmers from land seizures and agrarian outrages. And that's why Kevin O'Shiel had been sent out there after a delegation had come to the Dáil. They had before that asked the RIC for help in terms of the agrarian outrages, and had been told, well, they didn't really have time to be dealing with their cattle and their land. So then they had gone to the Dáil and said, well, we need help from you. So essentially Kevin O'Shiel was then sent out to examine what was going on in terms of land seizures in Connacht. And the first Dáil court in County Mayo was to do with land seizures, and those who were convicted, because there were no prisons available to the Free State, were put out on an island in Lough Corrib as punishment. Okay, so in terms of this then entrenchment of the highly individualist system of farm ownership, I suppose the question to ask was this inevitable? And at each and every moment of time, however brief, there are numerous roads that branch off to the side of how events actually unfold. When viewed from the vantage point shaped by current orthodoxies, these divergent roads may seem destined to have ended up as cul-de-sacs, but to accept that past roads untaken by events could never have led anywhere is also to conclude that the present is inevitable, a preordained destiny towards which the past has been resolutely travelling. Making the roads untaken in history visible and remembering them encourages speculation on the futures they could have given rise to, and provides inspiration for those seeking alternatives to current orthodoxies. Brushing history against the grain, a commemorative event held in the centenary of heightened agrarian agitation in 1920, could remember not only the side-branching roads of that time period, the land seizures, the collective farms, the planting of soil for sustenance that others viewed purely in terms of profit, but also previous challenges to agrarian capitalism and the primacy of private property. These include such diverse aspects of Irish history as the Owenite agrarian communities established by William Thompson and John Scott Vandeleur in pre-famine Ireland, the Rundale system of land use and dwelling, the rights of occupancy that tenant farmers asserted throughout the 19th century, Michael Davitt's advocacy of land nationalisation, and James Connolly's conception of Gaelic communism. Attention could be paid to earlier acts of resistance that cross over with what O'Shiel witnessed in 1920, such as the collective turning up of grassland that George Cornwall Lewis, O'Shiel's pre-famine equivalent, wrote about in his 1836 book Local Disturbances in Ireland. As was the case with the later Roscommon agitators described by O'Shiel, the weapons of choice of the several hundred or even several thousand men that Cornwall Lewis talks about that gathered to partake in this activity were farming implements. The result of their efforts was that the land, essentially transformed from grassy pasture to muddy soil, was no longer fit for grazing, and the owners had no choice but to let it out for potatoes. The similarities between these practices, separated by over 80 years, point to an enduring tension in pre-Free State Ireland between large grazing operations and small-scale tillage farming, as is made clear in the following passage from Samuel Clarke's Social Origins of the Irish Land War. This tension was grounded not in abstract debates about the benefits or not of agrarian capitalism, but in the material conditions of day-to-day living. Small farmers and labourers, Clarke points out, depended on the preservation of tillage land to find a place to grow their potatoes and for agricultural employment. Is this my water, Peter? It's not been sitting around for weeks. Okay, grand. Okay. The widespread hostility among the poor against grazing and against farmers who specialise in grazing indicates that these people were well aware of the danger that pasture farming presented to their interests. In the opening pages of his 1897 pamphlet Erin's Hope, James Connolly claimed that pre-conquest Ireland had been, quote, inspired by the democratic principle that property was intended to serve the people, and not by the principle so universally acted upon at present, that the people have no other function in existing than to be the bond slaves of those who by force or by fraud have managed to possess themselves of property. This principle manifested itself, he went on to argue, in a common ownership of land or primitive communism that could potentially provide the basis for a future system of non-exploitative landholding in an independent Ireland, and this is Connolly's concept essentially of Gaelic communism. Now, Connolly's depiction of the land system in pre-colonial Ireland was clearly an idealised one, designed, as Gregory Dobbins suggests, to redirect the traditional away from the conventional nationalist project and create an indigenous precedent for socialism. But absolute ownership of land would indeed appear to have been rare in early Irish society. Gaelic landholding may have differed from region to region, at least far more so than is acknowledged in Erin's Hope, but certain characteristics were common throughout the country, most notably the absence of a concept of absolute ownership of land. So in terms of the overlord, for example, certain lands were attached to his office, his title, but these were technically the property of the entire sept as opposed to the property of the individual lord. And of course this becomes an issue in terms of the colonial policy of surrender and grant, which actually, when I remember doing this at school and not understanding it, it made absolutely no sense to me in terms of how it was explained to school children. Like that they give their land away and then they get it back again. And you're going like, what was that about, you know? And it only makes sense in terms of when you're thinking about those bigger issues around property rights, etc. So, of course, what this meant is that from the 1940s to the early 17th century, Irish chiefs who had not yet been displaced were required to give up their rights and lands as defined by Gaelic custom and receive them back from the Crown in a form of absolute ownership, more compatible with English property law. And this constituted an attack on the Gaelic polity, but particularly because it was actually an attack on the system of landholding that underpinned it. So again, we have that sort of consistency in terms of the clarification, the desire to clarify property law in Ireland running through quite an extended period of time. And it's certainly questionable, I think. I mean, some commentators in the mid-19th century were claiming that they could find remnants of a Gaelic landholding in contemporary Ireland, and I think that's really open to debate, and it is very questionable. Certainly, occupancy would have seemed to have been a key aspect of Gaelic landholding, in terms of even the unfree gained the right of inheritance after a period of uninterrupted occupancy. So I suppose what can be said, I think, while it's almost impossible to say, well, whether there is actually in mid-19th century Ireland, there are still remnants of Gaelic landholding. But I think what we can say is that the attitude of the Irish tenantry towards their land suggested that they perceived themselves as having a substantial right to it, notwithstanding its ownership by others. It was this perception that contemporary commentators like George Campbell drew attention to when arguing that the actualities of land relations in Ireland was anomalous from the perspective of Irish property law. And the later Bessborough Commission was to draw attention to some of the practical difficulties that resulted from this discrepancy between law and practice. So, and I quote from the Commission, "In Ireland it has been the general rule for tenants to do more at all events than the mere agricultural operations necessary to ensure them such a profit as could be realised within the time which constituted the legal terms of their tenancies." Tenant farmers also asserted their right to the land they occupied in more active ways, such as in the resistance to a landlord's attempt to sell, lease and evict as he or she pleased. For Campbell, putting out of sight the customary law of the land and asserting that the theoretical English law was the only law had resulted in the following situation. Quote, "In theory, the landlords are absolute owners, but in fact are they so? Most assuredly not. Under these circumstances," he argued, "it is mere superstition to talk as if it would be a sacrilege to acknowledge some sort of claim to a property which is already so fixed in the hearts and language of the people of Ireland, low and high. Recognising the occupiers as in some sense co-proprietors of the land, according to Campbell, would only be giving the people in law what in practice they already have. The Land Acts that William Gladstone introduced in 1870 and 1881 were in essence an attempt to bridge the gap between custom and law that George Campbell had outlined by providing a legal framework for the actual relationship that existed between the Irish tenant farmer and the land he or she occupied. Notwithstanding the aforementioned later clarification of Irish property law, alternative approaches to land and land usage, whether associated with individuals like James Connolly or small tenant farmers and landless labourers, formed the basis for some of the possible roads that could have been taken in the run-up to the establishment of the Irish Free State. In the post-revolutionary period, however, an overly rigid and stringently enforced concept of private ownership prevailed. This rigid concept of private ownership is grounded in the Land Purchase Acts introduced by the British Conservative Party, but it was sanctified by a national narrative that mapped the ownership of Ireland by the Irish onto private property rights by suggesting that the colonial struggle was all about owning the land, taking it back from the landlords, with ownership interpreted here in the narrowest sense of the term. The overlapping of the ownership of Ireland by the Irish with the private ownership of property and land has manifested itself in multiple ways since the founding of the state. In the early stages of the Free State, it allowed for the establishment of a precedent whereby home ownership was to be prioritised over all other housing options. And this is something that Conor McCabe has talked about in his, I think, quite badly named book, Sins of the Father, the decisions that shaped the Irish economy. While there were public house building programmes at intervals, in periods between, it's not difficult to find overlaps between Cumann na Gael's decision in the mid-1920s to reduce the level of construction undertaken by local authorities and instead divert public funds to private builders via grants and tax breaks, and the developer-friendly policy decisions made by later Irish governments that contributed to the overheated housing market during the Celtic Tiger period. The ownership of, or the mapping of the ownership of Ireland by the Irish onto private property rights and the subsequent establishment of owner occupancy as the housing norm have facilitated an especially negative attitude in Ireland towards those who, whether through tradition, choice or lack of resources, don't own property. Thus, Peter Casey, a candidate in the 2018 Irish presidential election, could substantially increase his vote by opportunistically referring to travellers as basically people camping on someone else's land. I was sort of very reluctant about, I had to think a lot about whether I would include any reference to Peter Casey, because I think he got so much coverage in terms of the presidential election and in the weeks afterwards, and so much media play, which I think was, and he is somebody, he has a Trump-like quality of just liking attention no matter what it is, but at least I thought I wouldn't put a picture of him up anyway. In the late 19th century, some British commentators argued that to interfere with absolute property rights was to alter the laws for governing the world. Private property rights may form the cornerstone of the capitalist mode of production, but the success of capitalism relies on the widespread acceptance of such rights as the cornerstone of what it is to be human. The threat to the natural order that these commentators believed was posed by Gladstone's Land Acts can be equated to the threat that some believe to be posed by the transient lifestyle traditionally associated with Irish travellers. While not faced with such open discrimination, non-travellers over a certain age who rent their homes rather than own them are often viewed with disapproval, especially if the renter in question is not actively seeking to become an owner at some stage in the near future. Thus, even when house prices rise to untenable levels, as with the property bubble from the late 1990s to 2007, the pressure to buy and own property is extreme. Sympathy for those in their 30s, 40s and older who fail to get on the property ladder and then, due to a rent hike, become homeless is invariably undercut by misgivings as to why they were still renting at this stage of their lives. So consequently, for those who want to actually encourage empathy and sympathy and increase the public's interest in homelessness in Ireland, the best way that they can do that is to focus on the plight of children who are forced to grow up in appropriate hotel accommodation and travel long journeys to and from school, because they, unlike the parents, are at least guaranteed to be seen by the public as blameless victims. The 2020 commemorative event that I'm proposing could be organised in conjunction with individuals and movements from Ireland and elsewhere that currently adhere to and attempt to advance an alternative relationship with property and land. This could include members of the Home Sweet Home Coalition and Irish Housing Network, which famously took over the NAMA-owned Apollo House office block on Tara Street in Dublin in December 2016 to provide emergency accommodation for people who are homeless and would otherwise have found it difficult to get shelter over the Christmas period. Amongst those involved in the coalition at the time were trade unionists, charity workers and some high-profile individuals such as the actor and traveller activist John Connors. And it's interesting, I mean, John Connors is a really fascinating character in that John Connors sort of never ended up being an activist or traveller activist kind of by default. You know, he essentially he was an actor in Love Hate, and he says himself that what invariably happened is that other actors from Love Hate would be invited onto the radio for interviews, and they'd be asked questions like who would attend your ideal dinner party, or would you like to go and work in Hollywood? And he was never asked those questions. He was asked instead about traveller feuding and rural crime. So in the process of those interviews, he ends up becoming a traveller activist. But in terms of the occupation of the vacant Apollo House, what the response to this, and quite heated response to it, revealed is that the taking over of even empty and derelict buildings is viewed by landlords and developers, whose wealth is largely reliant on the primacy of private property, as a breach of the market. In occupying Apollo House, the Home Sweet Home activists were asserting an alternative set of rights that they believed surpassed private property rights, including the rights to dignity and shelter. Its proximity to Christmas, combined with the involvement of celebrities and high-profile trade union activists, ensured that the Home Sweet Home occupation was heavily and for the most part positively reported in the mainstream media. Indeed, one of the better known members of the coalition, Oscar-winning singer-songwriter Glenn Hansard, here with his guitar, was invited onto RTÉ's premiere chat show, The Late Late Show, and the week before Christmas to talk to a mostly receptive audience about the occupation and the extent to which it constituted a justifiable act of civil disobedience. Amongst the less well-known and less well-received Irish movements that could take part in a commemorative event celebrating alternative concepts and practices of property and land usage in Ireland are the former inhabitants of Squat City. Though it didn't garner nearly as much media attention, Squat City in Grangegorman, Dublin, was a more long-term initiative, being intermittently home to dozens of squatters from 2013 to 2018. Some squatted there out of necessity, while others chose to live there, viewing squatting simultaneously as a political act and a way of life. They claimed the right to occupy an empty premises for the purpose of living is to challenge a counterintuitive societal norm whereby vacant land and property cannot be used by those who need it because it is owned by someone who currently has no use for it. And I was talking to a friend of mine who lives in Grangegorman who says that actually that area now it's private student accommodation, and that most people in the area are really missing the squatters. They thought they were much better neighbours than the students living in student accommodation. In that they actually had made kind of good inroads into the community. They had got involved in art projects with local schools or whatever. They had done a quite good job at forming connections. Others that could take part in the event would be the Take Back the City coalition, which in 2018 most famously occupied 34 North Frederick Street, a property that had lain empty for a number of years, and then were forcibly and quite brutally removed by a private security company with the collusion of the guards. One of the main strategies employed by the coalition is to occupy private buildings that have been empty for several years, and this functions to draw attention to the incongruity of there being a total area of nearly 7 times the size of St. Stephen's Green, comprised of vacant or derelict sites in central Dublin in the midst of an unprecedented homeless crisis in the city. Take Back the City Coalition are also involved in anti-eviction activity, and I think there's a body of work to be done on contemporary anti-eviction activity because it's quite nuanced in terms of what's happening. The Take Back the City are generally involved in cases where landlords are evicting tenants, and there are other groups like the National Land League and the New Land League which are quite keen to differentiate themselves from each other, and as well as the kind of activities of Take Back the City, the anti-eviction activities of that group, which are to kind of protect those who are more economically marginalised from becoming homeless. The anti-eviction movements now also include, like, I think really a protection of private property rights, protecting some of those who, very wealthy people who did quite well out of the Celtic Tiger, for example, and now owe banks significant amounts of money at this stage. So there is a lot of different groups involved in anti-eviction agitation, and they're not all coming from the same direction at all. Okay, so in terms of, I suppose, what I've hoped to suggest in this paper is that the overly rigid and stringently enforced concept of private ownership that became such a feature of post-revolutionary Ireland was neither inevitable nor innately Irish. By drawing attention to side-branching roads from both the past and the present, a commemorative event held in the centenary of acts of resistance by those who did not benefit from the Land Purchase Acts could encourage speculation on a future alternative relationship with land and property, a relationship grounded in concepts and practices of use and occupancy. And I'll leave that there, but very much invite questions and comments. Thank you very much.